My wife told our financial advisor in front of me that she married me as an inheritance scheme to collect my family's trust fund after my father died. Jeffrey Holbrook's office overlooked the Hudson River from the 32nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the water like an expensive painting. I sat in one of the leather chairs across from his mahogany desk, while my wife Catherine perched in the chair beside mine, her Chanel suit perfectly pressed and her diamond wedding band catching the afternoon light. We were there to discuss restructuring my father's trust fund, which I'd inherited 6 months earlier after his sudden death from a stroke. Jeffrey had been my family's wealth manager for 20 years, and he'd scheduled this meeting to review investment strategies and tax implications now that the trust was fully under my control. Catherine had insisted on attending, claiming she wanted to understand our financial future better, and I'd been grateful for her interest in our joint planning. Jeffrey pulled up spreadsheets on his computer screen and began walking us through the trust portfolio. Your father built this carefully over 40 years, Owen. The current value is approximately $8.3 million, diversified across equities, bonds, and real estate holdings. Now that the trust has transferred to you following the mandatory 6-month probate period, we need to discuss distribution strategies, tax optimization, and long-term wealth preservation. He turned the monitor toward us so we could see the detailed breakdown of assets. Catherine leaned forward to study the numbers, and I noticed her expression shift from polite interest to something harder, more calculating. She glanced at Jeffrey, then at me, and smiled in a way that made my stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. I should probably just tell you both the truth now since the money's finally available and there's no point pretending anymore. Jeffrey's pen stopped moving on his notepad, and he looked at Catherine with polite confusion. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thorne. What truth are you referring to? Catherine crossed her legs and settled back in her chair like she was discussing weekend plans, rather than dropping a bomb into our marriage. I married Owen specifically to inherit this trust fund after his father died. The whole relationship was designed to position me as the surviving spouse with access to the family wealth. I researched the Thorne family trust structure, identified Owen as the sole heir, engineered our meeting at that charity gala 3 years ago, and executed a plan to marry him before his father's health declined further. Richard Thorne's medical records indicated he had severe hypertension and refused proper treatment, so I calculated he had maybe 3 to 5 years left. Turned out I was right. He lasted 31 months after our wedding. Now the trust is released from probate, Owen controls the full amount, and as his wife, I have legal claim to half of everything in a divorce. Mission accomplished. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence destroying another piece of the life I thought I'd built. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what Catherine had just said with such casual cruelty. Jeffrey stared at her with his mouth slightly open, professional composure completely shattered. Mrs. Thorne, are you saying you entered into marriage with Mr. Thorne under fraudulent pretenses for the purpose of financial gain through inheritance and subsequent divorce? Catherine laughed and pulled out her phone. I'm saying exactly that. Want to see the timeline I created? I have spreadsheets tracking Richard's health decline, estate planning documents I obtained through various sources, and communications with my mother about strategy and timing. We've been planning this for 4 years, since before I even met Owen. She started scrolling through her phone while I sat paralyzed. My mother did the preliminary research, identified the Thorne family trust as a target, and I handled the execution. It's not even the first time we've done this, though it is our biggest score. The previous inheritance was only $2 million, and that husband was easier to manipulate than Owen turned out to be. Jeffrey found his voice, though it came out sharp and professionally angry. Mrs. Thorne, what you're describing is criminal fraud, conspiracy to commit theft by deception, and potential elder abuse if you had any contact with Richard Thorne that influenced his medical decisions or estate planning. This is not just grounds for divorce without settlement. This is grounds for criminal prosecution and civil damages far beyond the trust value. He reached for his phone. I need to call the firm's legal counsel immediately. Owen, don't say anything else. Catherine, I strongly advise you to stop talking and retain an attorney. Catherine shrugged and stood up from her chair. Whatever. I've already consulted with my own attorney about the legal exposure, and we've determined that proving intent is nearly impossible unless you have documentary evidence, which Owen doesn't. The trust is in his name, I'm his legal wife, and community property laws in New York give me substantial claim to marital assets regardless of his family's money. You can call whoever you want, but I'll be walking away with at least $3 million when this is done. She walked toward the door without looking back at me. Owen, I'll be moving into the Tribeca apartment we looked at last month. I already put down the deposit using our joint account. You can stay in the brownstone. My attorney will be in touch about the divorce filing within 48 hours. Thanks for being such an easy mark. The door closed behind Catherine, and I sat in Jeffrey's office, unable to move, unable to speak, my entire reality fracturing around me. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of what I believed was love and partnership and building a life together, and it had all been an elaborate con to steal my family's money. Jeffrey moved his chair closer to mine, and his voice was gentle when he finally spoke. Owen, I need you to focus. What Catherine just admitted to constitutes serious criminal fraud. She revealed premeditation, conspiracy with her mother, previous victims, and documentary evidence of the scheme, but she's right that we need proof beyond her verbal admission. Did you record this conversation? Do you have access to her phone or computer? Has she said anything else about this plan before today? I shook my head because nothing made sense. She never mentioned anything. Our whole marriage seemed normal. We met at the Metropolitan Museum Gala 3 years ago. She was there with friends from her marketing firm. We started talking about the Impressionist collection, and she seemed genuinely interested in art history and my work as a professor. We dated for 8 months before I proposed. My father liked her. She visited him regularly at his apartment in the months before he died, brought him books, talked with him about his naval career. I thought she cared about my family. Now I'm realizing every single interaction was calculated and fake. Jeffrey pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. The visits to your father concern me greatly. If Catherine had any influence over Richard's medical treatment or estate decisions, that could constitute elder fraud or abuse. We need to review Richard's medical records from the last 3 years to see if Catherine's visits corresponded with any changes in his treatment compliance or medication management. She mentioned he refused proper treatment for hypertension. Did Catherine ever discuss his health with you in ways that might have discouraged him from seeking care? The memories started clicking into place with horrible clarity. Catherine had told me several times that my father seemed content with his lifestyle choices, and that pressuring him about blood pressure medication made him stressed, which was worse for his health than just letting him live how he wanted. She'd suggested I back off and stop nagging him about doctor's appointments. She'd convinced me that respecting his autonomy was more important than forcing medical intervention. I'd listened to her advice, stopped pushing my father to take his hypertension seriously, and 6 months later, he had a massive stroke in his study and died before the ambulance arrived. The guilt I'd carried about not doing more to save him suddenly transformed into rage at Catherine for potentially engineering his death. Jeffrey, she convinced me to stop pressuring him about treatment. She said it was better for his mental health to let him make his own choices. What if she was deliberately accelerating his decline? Jeffrey's expression went grim. That's potentially negligent homicide or even manslaughter if we can prove Catherine intentionally interfered with Richard's medical care to hasten his death for financial gain. He stood up and walked to his office door, locking it from the inside. Owen, we need to treat this situation as an active crime scene. Don't touch anything Catherine might have left in your home. Don't delete any communications between you. Don't confront her or her mother. I'm calling Leonard Whitmore, the criminal defense attorney our firm uses for serious fraud cases. He'll know how to proceed with law enforcement and evidence preservation. This is beyond civil litigation. This is a criminal conspiracy that may involve multiple victims and potentially a death. You need to understand the severity of what Catherine just confessed to. Jeffrey made the call to Leonard Whitmore while I sat processing the magnitude of Catherine's betrayal. My father might be dead because my wife engineered his death. Our entire marriage was a lie constructed to position her for inheritance theft. She'd done this before to other men, which meant there were other victims, other families destroyed by her schemes. Leonard Whitmore arrived at Jeffrey's office 90 minutes later, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the focused intensity of someone who'd built a career on high-stakes criminal defense. He sat across from me in Jeffrey's conference room and asked detailed questions about Catherine's confession, the timeline of our relationship, her interactions with my father, and any evidence I might have about her activities. Mr. Thorne, what your wife admitted to in this office constitutes multiple serious crimes including fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, potential insurance fraud if there were life insurance policies involved, and possibly negligent homicide if she interfered with your father's medical care. The fact that she mentioned previous victims means this is likely an ongoing criminal enterprise. We need to contact the Manhattan District Attorney's Fraud Division immediately. But first, I need to know what documentation you have access to. Does Catherine have a home office? Does she keep files or computers that might contain the evidence she referenced? I thought about our brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, the house we'd bought together 18 months ago with money from my professor's salary, and what Catherine claimed was her savings from her marketing career. She had a home office on the 3rd floor where she worked remotely several days a week. I'd never questioned what she kept in there because I'd trusted her completely. Now I realized that office probably contained evidence of her entire fraud operation. She has a dedicated office. She keeps it locked when she's not home, and told me it was because she had confidential client files. I never went in there without her permission. Leonard nodded slowly. That locked office likely contains documentation of the conspiracy. We need to secure that evidence before Catherine realizes the legal danger she's in and destroys everything. Here's what we're going to do. You're going to go home right now with a police escort, and you're going to secure Catherine's office. I'm calling a friend at the DA's office who specializes in financial crimes. We're going to get an emergency search warrant for that office based on Catherine's admission witnessed by Jeffrey. This moves fast from here. Leonard made 3 phone calls in rapid succession while I listened in a daze. He spoke with someone named Diane Ashford at the Manhattan District Attorney's office, explaining the situation and Catherine's confession. I could hear Diane's voice through the phone, sharp and professional. If Holbrook is willing to provide sworn testimony about what the wife admitted, we can get a warrant within hours. This sounds like organized fraud possibly connected to other cases we're investigating. Have Mr. Thorne meet me at the Brooklyn Heights precinct in 2 hours. Bring all financial documents related to the father's estate, the trust, and any communications with the wife about the inheritance. Leonard hung up and looked at me with fierce determination. Owen, this is going to move very quickly. The DA's office has been investigating inheritance fraud schemes for the past year, and they're very interested in your wife. You need to prepare yourself for what comes next. Your marriage is over, your wife is likely going to prison, and you're going to have to testify about intimate details of your relationship. But you'll get justice for your father and for yourself. I left Jeffrey's office and took a car service back to Brooklyn Heights, my mind spinning with fragments of the past 3 years, recontextualized through the lens of Catherine's confession. The charity gala where we met, which I'd thought was chance, was actually Catherine targeting me. The whirlwind romance, which I'd thought was genuine chemistry, was actually her executing a plan to marry me before my father's health declined. Her affection toward my father, which I'd interpreted as respect for family, was actually Catherine cultivating access to influence his medical decisions. Every moment I'd treasured was contaminated by her deception. I arrived at our brownstone 45 minutes before I was supposed to meet Diane Ashford at the police precinct, and I used the time to photograph everything in the house that might be evidence. I took pictures of Catherine's locked office door, the papers on her desk in our bedroom, her laptop charging on the kitchen counter, and our joint financial files in the study. Then I packed a bag with clothes and documents because Leonard had warned me I probably wouldn't be able to stay in the house once the police executed the search warrant. The Brooklyn Heights precinct was a modern facility 3 blocks from the waterfront, and Diane Ashford met me in a conference room on the 2nd floor. She was a black woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Mr. Thorne, thank you for coming in so quickly. I've been briefed on your wife's admission by Leonard Whitmore and Jeffrey Holbrook. What Catherine described matches the pattern of several unsolved fraud cases we've been investigating over the past 18 months. I believe your wife and her mother are part of a sophisticated inheritance fraud ring that targets wealthy men, engineers marriages, and then profits from either divorce settlements or life insurance policies after suspicious deaths. Your father's case might not be the first death connected to their scheme. She pulled out photographs of 2 other men, both in their 60s, both dead under circumstances that had seemed natural at the time. Do you recognize either of these men? I studied the photographs carefully, but neither face was familiar. No, I've never seen them. Who are they? Diane tapped the first photograph. This is Thomas Lancaster. Died 2 years ago from complications of diabetes. After his new wife allegedly helped him manage his medication, his children suspected foul play because their father's glucose levels had been stable for years before the marriage, then suddenly became erratic. The wife inherited $3 million and disappeared before the children could challenge the will. The second photograph showed a younger man, maybe 50, with kind eyes. This is Gregory Hartwell, died 18 months ago from a heart attack at age 52, with no prior cardiac history. His wife inherited his real estate portfolio worth approximately $4 million and divorced his business partner who'd been trying to investigate irregularities in Gregory's final months. Both wives used different names, but the descriptions match your wife Catherine, and both mentioned having a mother who helped them plan financial strategy. Diane pulled up driver's license photos on her laptop, and I felt my stomach drop. The woman in Thomas Lancaster's wedding photo was Catherine, though. She'd called herself Michelle Lancaster. The woman in Gregory Hartwell's wedding photo was also Catherine, using the name Diana Hartwell. Catherine has been doing this for years. Multiple identities, multiple victims, multiple deaths. I felt sick realizing I'd married a serial predator who'd potentially murdered multiple men for their money. Diane nodded gravely. We believe Catherine is using various identities and working with at least one accomplice, likely her mother, to identify wealthy targets, engineer relationships, and then profit from their deaths or divorces. The pattern is consistent. Short courtship, quick marriage, isolation of the victim from family and friends, influence over medical or financial decisions, and then either a convenient death or a lucrative divorce. You're lucky she revealed the scheme before anything happened to you. Based on her admission that she's done this before, and her reference to previous victims, we have probable cause for a search warrant. Judge Morrison is reviewing the application now, and we should have authorization within the hour. When we execute that warrant at your home, I need you to stay here at the precinct. This is an active crime scene, and we can't have you potentially contaminating evidence. The search warrant was approved at 7 p.m., and Diane led a team of 6 detectives to my brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. I watched from the precinct conference room via video feed as they entered my home with locksmith tools and crime scene equipment. They breached Catherine's locked office and found exactly what Diane had suspected. Extensive documentation of multiple fraud schemes. Filing cabinets contained folders labeled with men's names and dollar amounts. A wall-mounted whiteboard showed a timeline of my relationship with Catherine, including notation about my father's declining health and the trust fund release date. Her computer contained spreadsheets tracking multiple targets, email communications with her, mother discussing strategy, and scanned identification documents under at least 5 different names. Diane called me from my house with barely contained excitement. Owen, we've found evidence of at least 7 different fraud schemes, including yours. Catherine has been operating under multiple identities for the past decade. We found communications planning your father's death, discussions about medication tampering, and references to insurance fraud. This is massive. We're arresting Catherine tonight and bringing her mother in for questioning tomorrow. Catherine was arrested at the Tribeca apartment she'd rented using our joint account, taken into custody without incident at 9:30 p.m. Diane called to inform me that Catherine had immediately requested an attorney and refused to make any statements. Her mother, Eleanor Novak, was arrested the following morning at her home in Westchester County after detectives found evidence connecting her to the conspiracy. Both women were charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and 2 counts of negligent homicide in the deaths of Thomas Lancaster and Gregory Hartwell. Additional charges were pending as investigators reviewed evidence from Catherine's office. Leonard Whitmore arranged for me to stay at a hotel in Manhattan while the brownstone remained an active crime scene, and I spent 3 days in a fog of shock and grief processing the magnitude of Catherine's crimes. My father was dead potentially because my wife had manipulated his medical care. 2 other men were dead under suspicious circumstances after marrying Catherine under different names. I'd been targeted, deceived, and married under completely fraudulent pretenses. The media discovered the story within 48 hours of Catherine's arrest, and suddenly my private nightmare became public spectacle. The New York Times ran a front-page story with the headline, "Serial Inheritance Fraud Ring Exposed After Wives. Shocking Confession." The article detailed Catherine's multiple identities, the 7 known victims including me, and the ongoing investigation into whether more deaths were connected to her schemes. Catherine's photograph was everywhere, my father's name was mentioned repeatedly, and journalists camped outside the hotel where I was staying. Leonard arranged for me to give a single press conference to control the narrative and reduce media harassment. I stood in front of cameras at Leonard's law firm and made a brief statement. Catherine Thorne, who I knew as my wife, admitted in front of witnesses that she married me as part of a scheme to steal my family's inheritance after engineering my father's death. I'm cooperating fully with law enforcement to ensure she faces justice for her crimes. I ask for privacy as I process this betrayal and grieve for my father and the other victims of her fraud. The preliminary hearing for Catherine and Eleanor took place 6 weeks after their arrests in a packed Manhattan courtroom. I sat in the gallery watching as prosecutors presented evidence of the conspiracy, Catherine's multiple fake identities documented in her office, communications between Catherine and Eleanor planning my father's death through medication interference, financial records showing payments from previous victims' estates into accounts controlled by Catherine and Eleanor, and testimony from the families of Thomas Lancaster and Gregory Hartwell about suspicious circumstances surrounding those deaths. The judge, Teresa Vaughn, reviewed the evidence with visible disgust. Ms. Novak and Ms. Thorne, the evidence presented suggests you engaged in a systematic, decade-long conspiracy to defraud and potentially murder wealthy men for financial gain. The premeditation and callousness demonstrated in your communications is extraordinary. I'm denying bail and remanding both defendants to custody pending trial. The risk of flight is substantial given your documented use of multiple identities. Catherine's attorney, David Krause, tried to argue that Catherine's confession in Jeffrey's office was taken out of context and that the evidence from her home office was inadmissible because I didn't have legal authority to authorize the search. Judge Vaughn dismissed the argument immediately. Mr. Krause, your client made an unsolicited confession witnessed by 2 professionals. Mr. Thorne, as the homeowner and legal resident, had authority to grant access to shared spaces in the marital home. The evidence is admissible and overwhelming. Your client and her co-conspirator are facing multiple felony charges, including 2 counts of negligent homicide. I suggest you focus on plea negotiations rather than procedural challenges. The hearing concluded with Catherine and Eleanor being led back to holding cells, and I left the courthouse feeling the first flicker of vindication. The legal system was taking Catherine's crimes seriously and moving toward justice. Leonard met me outside the courthouse and explained the next steps. The DA's office is building their case for trial, but Krause is already making noise about a plea deal. Catherine knows the evidence is overwhelming, and a trial will expose every detail of her fraud to the jury. I expect we'll see plea negotiations within a month. The evidence against Catherine continued to mount as investigators dug deeper into her past. Detectives discovered that Catherine and Eleanor had been running similar schemes for 15 years, starting with smaller frauds against elderly victims in assisted living facilities before graduating to inheritance fraud against wealthy widowers and heirs. They'd refined their technique over time, with Eleanor handling research and target identification, while Catherine executed the seduction and marriage. The 2 women had accumulated approximately $12 million through various frauds, most of which they'd moved offshore or laundered through shell companies. Asset recovery became a major component of the criminal case as prosecutors worked to seize every dollar Catherine and Eleanor had stolen. My father's estate was protected because the trust had been established before Catherine entered my life, but the other victims' families weren't as fortunate. The families of Thomas Lancaster and Gregory Hartwell filed wrongful death lawsuits against Catherine and Eleanor, seeking damages for the suspicious deaths of their loved ones. I was deposed as part of the criminal case 6 weeks after Catherine's arrest, answering detailed questions about our relationship timeline, Catherine's interactions with my father, and any conversations we'd had about the trust fund. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Devereaux, walked me through every stage of Catherine's manipulation. Mr. Thorne, when did Catherine first mention your father's trust fund? I remembered the conversation from early in our relationship, maybe 3 months after we started dating. She asked about my family background during dinner at a restaurant in Soho, and I'd mentioned that my father had built a successful import business and established a trust for me. Catherine had seemed casually interested, asking questions about the trust structure and when it would transfer to me. At the time, I'd thought she was just getting to know my family history. Now I understood she was gathering intelligence for her scheme. She asked about it maybe 3 months into dating. I told her the trust would transfer to me after my father's death, following a 6-month probate period. She asked specific questions about the value and the conditions for release. Rachel made detailed notes. And when did Catherine start visiting your father regularly? I traced the timeline back. About 4 months before he died, she suggested we should visit him more often because he seemed lonely. She started going to his apartment twice a week, sometimes without me, to bring him books and keep him company. She'd come home and tell me about their conversations, how much he enjoyed her company, how he'd opened up to her about his naval career and his regrets about my mother's early death. I thought she was being caring and building a relationship with my father. Now I know she was gaining access to influence his behavior. Rachel leaned forward. Did Catherine ever discuss your father's medication with you, or with him directly? The question triggered a specific memory I'd suppressed because it had made me feel guilty. Yes. She told my father that blood pressure medication had serious side effects, and that many doctors overprescribed it. She gave him articles about pharmaceutical companies pushing unnecessary medications. My father, who already disliked taking pills, used Catherine's information to justify stopping his hypertension medication. When I confronted her about encouraging his non-compliance, she said she was just giving him information to make informed choices. Rachel's expression hardened. Mr. Thorne, what Catherine did constitutes reckless endangerment at minimum and potentially criminally negligent homicide. She deliberately provided false medical information to a vulnerable person with a serious health condition, knowing that non-compliance would likely result in a stroke or heart attack. That wasn't casual conversation. That was a calculated act designed to hasten his death so the trust would release to you and she could access it through divorce. Her actions directly contributed to your father's death. The weight of that reality crushed me, and I broke down in the deposition room. Rachel called a recess and gave me time to compose myself before continuing. When we resumed, she asked about my financial arrangements with Catherine during our marriage. Did you have joint accounts? Did Catherine have access to your personal accounts? Did she know the details of the trust? I explained that we'd maintained mostly separate finances during the marriage, with a joint account for shared expenses, but separate checking and savings accounts for our individual incomes. Catherine had never had access to my personal accounts or the trust. That's probably why she needed a divorce, rather than just draining accounts directly. The trust was in my name only, not convertible to joint ownership, so her only path to the money was through community property division in divorce. The investigation expanded further when police contacted other potential victims based on names found in Catherine's files. 5 additional men came forward reporting suspicious relationships with women matching Catherine's description, though in those cases the frauds had been interrupted before marriage, or the men had become suspicious and ended relationships before Catherine could execute her scheme. One man, Christopher Walsh, no wait, I can't use Walsh. One man, Christopher Bennett, described how a woman calling herself Jennifer had pursued him aggressively after his wife died, researched his deceased wife's favorite restaurants and hobbies to create false common ground, and pushed for a quick marriage. Christopher had become suspicious when Jennifer knew details about his late wife that he'd never shared, and he'd hired a private investigator who discovered Jennifer's real identity was Catherine Novak, and she had a history of fraud. Christopher had broken off the relationship and moved to a different city to avoid her, but he'd never reported the attempted fraud to police because he had no proof of her intent. Now, his testimony provided additional evidence of Catherine's predatory pattern and her willingness to target grieving widowers. The trial was scheduled for 6 months after Catherine's arrest, but plea negotiations intensified in the weeks before jury selection. David Krause approached Rachel Devereaux with a proposal. Catherine would plead guilty to multiple counts of fraud and 1 count of negligent homicide in my father's death in exchange for a 20-year sentence with possibility of parole after 15 years. Eleanor would plead guilty to conspiracy charges and receive a 12-year sentence. Both women would cooperate with asset recovery efforts and provide information about any additional victims or crimes. Rachel presented the plea offer to me and the families of the other victims during a meeting at the DA's office. Mr. Thorne, the plea deal ensures Catherine serves significant prison time and admits guilt for what she did to your father. However, it means there won't be a trial. You won't get to confront her in court. The other families and I need to decide if we're willing to accept the plea or if we want to proceed to trial and risk an acquittal on some charges. I looked at the faces of the other victims' families, seeing my own grief and rage reflected in their expressions. Thomas Lancaster's daughter, Rebecca, spoke first. I want Catherine to admit she killed my father. I want it on the record that she deliberately interfered with his diabetes care to cause his death. If the plea includes that admission, I can accept it. Gregory Hartwell's son, Nathan, nodded in agreement. My father was 52 years old and healthy. Catherine destroyed him for money. I want justice, but I also want certainty. A trial could go wrong. A plea guarantees she goes to prison. I considered my options carefully. Catherine's confession in Jeffrey's office had triggered this entire investigation, but a trial would expose even more details about her manipulation and my father's death. It would be painful to relive publicly. The plea deal offered guaranteed punishment and admission of guilt without the uncertainty and trauma of a trial. I accept the plea deal if Catherine admits in open court that she deliberately interfered with my father's medical care to hasten his death for financial gain. I want that confession on the record. Rachel agreed to include that requirement in the plea agreement, and negotiations with David Krause concluded within 3 days. The plea hearing took place on a cold morning in November, 8 months after Catherine's confession in Jeffrey's office. The courtroom was packed with victims' families, media representatives, and observers who'd followed the case. Catherine and Eleanor were brought in wearing prison uniforms, looking diminished and defeated compared to the confident women they'd been before arrest. Judge Vaughn reviewed the plea agreement and turned to Catherine with barely concealed disgust. Ms. Thorne, you're pleading guilty to 7 counts of fraud, 3 counts of identity theft, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of negligent homicide. Do you understand that you're admitting to deliberately deceiving multiple men into marriage for financial gain, using false identities to avoid detection, and recklessly causing the death of Richard Thorne through interference with his medical care? Catherine's voice was barely audible when she responded. Yes, Your Honor. I understand. Judge Vaughn leaned forward. The court requires you to provide a full allocution describing your crimes. Explain what you did and why. Catherine took a shaky breath and began speaking in a flat, emotionless tone. I identified wealthy men who were vulnerable due to recent loss, poor health, or isolation from family. I researched their backgrounds, their interests, and their financial situations. I created false identities and engineered meetings that appeared coincidental. I built relationships designed to move quickly toward marriage before the targets could conduct thorough background checks or become suspicious of my motives. Once married, I worked to gain access to financial assets through joint accounts, life insurance policies, or community property rights. In some cases, I encouraged behavior that worsened pre-existing health conditions to hasten death and accelerate inheritance. In Owen Thorne's case, I deliberately provided false information about blood pressure medication to his father, Richard, knowing that non-compliance would likely cause a stroke or heart attack. Richard died from a stroke 6 months before the trust fund would have remained protected from divorce claims, which was my intended outcome. I planned to divorce Owen once the trust transferred to him and claim half the assets through community property laws. The courtroom was silent as Catherine continued her confession. I've been engaged in similar schemes for 15 years with my mother, Eleanor Novak. We've defrauded at least 12 men and caused the deaths of at least 2 men through medical interference. We accumulated approximately $12 million through these frauds, which we moved offshore to avoid detection. I knew my actions were wrong and illegal. I did them anyway because I wanted money and believed I was too clever to get caught. Judge Vaughn's voice was ice when she responded. Ms. Thorne, you're a predator who destroyed lives for profit. You're a murderer who killed vulnerable men through calculated manipulation. The sentence I'm imposing is 25 years in state prison, 5 years more than the recommended plea agreement, because the harm you've caused exceeds what can be adequately punished through the standard guidelines. You will serve a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. Eleanor Novak, you facilitated these crimes through research, planning, and money laundering. You receive 15 years with minimum of 12 before parole. Both of you will cooperate fully with asset recovery and victim restitution. Catherine and Eleanor were led from the courtroom in handcuffs while victims' families watched with grim satisfaction. Leonard approached me in the hallway outside and shook my hand firmly. Owen, it's over. Catherine will spend the next 2 decades in prison. Your father's death has been acknowledged as homicide. You're free to rebuild your life. I felt the weight of 8 months of legal proceedings, investigation, and trauma finally lifting from my shoulders. The brownstone in Brooklyn Heights had been released from evidence custody 3 months earlier, and I'd sold it immediately, unable to live in the space Catherine had contaminated with her presence. I'd taken a sabbatical from my teaching position at Columbia to focus on recovery, and I'd started working with a therapist who specialized in complex trauma and betrayal. The inheritance from my father's trust fund sat untouched in accounts managed by Jeffrey Holbrook, money I couldn't bring myself to spend knowing Catherine had engineered my father's death to access it. Jeffrey had suggested establishing a foundation in my father's name focused on elder abuse prevention and fraud victim support, and I'd started exploring that option as a way to transform tragedy into purpose. 3 years after Catherine's sentencing, I stood in the community center in Lower Manhattan at the grand opening of the Richard Thorne Foundation for Elder Protection and Fraud Prevention. The foundation provided legal assistance to families dealing with inheritance fraud, funded research into financial exploitation of vulnerable populations, and offered education programs to help people recognize and avoid predatory relationships. Rebecca Lancaster, Thomas's daughter, served on the foundation board, along with Nathan Hartwell, Gregory's son. We'd formed a bond through our shared experience of Catherine's predation, and we'd channeled our grief and rage into building systems that would protect others. The foundation had already helped 40 families navigate fraud cases, and had lobbied successfully for stronger elder protection laws in New York. My father's death had become a catalyst for change that would protect countless others from predators like Catherine. I'd met someone new, a librarian named Emma. No, wait, I can't use Emma. I'd met someone named Claire who worked at the foundation as a victim advocate, and we'd been dating cautiously for 6 months. She knew my history completely and understood my need to rebuild trust slowly. We were taking things one day at a time, with honesty and transparency as our foundation. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.